Welcome to a session to discuss whether there is a new Cold War bubbling in Africa. My name is Gillian Tett. I co-chair the editorial board at the Financial Times, which means that every morning at 6 o'clock in the morning, I get on a Zoom call with my senior colleagues around the world, and we brainstorm what's happening across the world at 6 o'clock so that we can get Asia in as well. And one of the themes that we've been very fascinated by recently is what's happening in Africa. It's not something that most Americans, frankly, spend much, if any, time thinking about. But during the early days of the Ukrainian conflict, or the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it became clear that although the West had rather lazily and arrogantly assumed that places like Africa would back them in the issues between Ukraine and Russia, in fact, much of sub-Saharan Africa took a different stance. And that reflects a long-running split or fracture in that the West has ignored many parts of Africa for many years. China, though, has rushed in and not only invested heavily in infrastructure, in raw minerals, commodities, but also in areas like telecoms. Something I happen to know well myself because the father of my children is actually from Nigeria, and we realized a few years ago that Chinese restaurants were the hot new thing in Lagos, and in fact the main type of food, which was actually good out there. Anyway, now Washington has woken up with a vengeance, partly because of what's happening in Ukraine, partly because of growing concern about supply chains around rare earth minerals and other key commodities, but also because of that telecoms issue and the fact that China has increasingly pulled a number of African countries into its telecoms net, and also, of course, because of the question of restructuring a sovereign debt, which is starting to become increasingly critical. Now, I suspect that most of you in the room don't spend much time thinking about this. Can I quickly put up a hand who's here because you don't know a lot about Africa, but you're kind of curious? Okay, the majority. How many of you are actually deeply involved in Africa or African business and trade, or from Africa? Okay, so the vast majority of you are here, and I am absolutely thrilled to collide with the unexpected and do exactly what festivals are all about, which is to get out of your groove and comfort zone. And after doing 20 sessions about the future of American democracy and climate change and healthcare, you're now going to do something different that's going to make you a lot more interesting at your next dinner party. But anyway, so we have two amazing people to talk to us about what's actually happening in Africa and the terrible tragedy and shame in that, in terms of the fact it doesn't get more attention. On my far left, your right, is Jendai Fraser, who is a former US ambassador to South Africa. She was also assistant, I get your title right, Undersecretary in charge of African Affairs at the State Department, is that right?
That's what the British would say.
Okay, that means wrong, basically. Whatever it was, you were very important at the State Department in charge of African issues.
It's the equivalent, assistant secretary, though.
Thank you, okay, right. And you're now running something called 50 Ventures, which is essentially about backing exciting projects or business projects, entrepreneurs with an African link. Yeah. That's correct, right. And next to her is Mbemba Feze Dizolele, who is currently basically overseeing the African program at CSIS. Long distinguished career advising and essentially analysing African affairs, previously a Marine, and at one stage was actually working with peacekeepers in Congo. So you've got a very on-the-ground perspective. And I think you were both at various points in your career, maybe together, at the Hoover Institute in Stanford, I saw in your bios. But anyway, so two real experts to talk to us, two proud Americans who are trying to forge better understanding of what is happening in Africa and why it matters so much right now. I'd like to start with you, Jendai, and say, from your perspective of having served in the State Department, can you give us some sense of basically what has gone wrong, or not gone wrong, and what the key issue is right now in terms of this developing Cold War?
Sure, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here with all of you. and I'm looking forward to our conversation. I think that it's important to put the idea of a Cold War in Africa in some type of historical context. And I say that because, in fact, it's not new that we're competing against China in Africa. That's been true even from the early and mid-1960s when the Chinese Communist Party basically ran out the nationalists, and they were competing with each other, i.e. Taiwan and the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing, or Peking, however you would like to say it at that time, were competing against each other ideologically to get newly independent African countries to recognize them. At that very same time, the United States, because these are newly independent African countries, was also trying to have a foothold there, trying to develop and establish relationships with these new emerging countries, and was competing, again, around an ideological issue of democracy, liberal democracy versus communism. So China was there competing, Russia was there competing on their communist side, supporting liberation movements that were still colonized, and America was in there largely supporting the European colonial powers, but pushing for decolonization through the League of Nations and the United Nations, and also trying to establish relations with these newly emerging countries like Ghana and others. And so the competition has always been there. Now, fast forward to today, I think what is important to say is that one context which I have is that we, the United States and the West, are in democracies that have changing governments, whereas these authoritarian capitalists like the Chinese or authoritarians like the Russians tend to have very long regimes with the same leadership. And so there is this shift of policy that's possible, particularly in the United States at a time when there was a time when Republicans and Democrats held a tremendous consensus over foreign policy. We always said politics stops at the border, right? And there was a consensus around how do you actually fight the Cold War against the Russians, the actual Cold War. There was a consensus around that. It didn't matter whether it was a Republican or a Democratic regime. And that has, in many ways, broken down. And the Ukrainian war, the Russian aggression against Ukraine, and the difference between the Republican voices in Congress saying stop supporting Ukraine, and most foreign policy establishment saying actually we have to support territorial integrity. And we have very much an alliance with the Europeans to support Ukraine against Russia, shows that that consensus has broken down, and that impacts how we, quote unquote, compete, strategic competition with China versus the way in which a consensus would have done it. The second thing I'll say very quickly on that point is the regime in China has changed. And so if you look at Hu Jintao and their engagement in Africa, which was around the same time that the Bush administration was there, the George W. Bush administration, 43, Hu Jintao and that push into Africa was very much based on getting raw materials, the natural resources to help fuel growth, fast growth in China. It was also, of course, their traditional competition against Taiwan. They wanted African governments to recognize China and not recognize Taiwan. That's been consistent throughout. But it was more of a mercantilist orientation to the continent. Now, when you get to Xi Jinping in 2012, things shift quite significantly. And Xi Jinping looks at himself as the leader of the global South. He wants China to rise as a global power, competing against the United States. That's where the strategic competition comes in. And he wants to change the liberal international order, i.e. the Bretton Woods institutions, so that they're more favorable to the rise of an authoritarian capitalist state like China. And so now you have a real competition going on internationally. In fact, the United States, one of the things that I tried to say often when Vice President Harris was going to Africa. And you see all these American leaders going to Africa, which is the sense of which the competition is really on, because our leaders are now going to Africa in quick succession. But I tried to say to many journalists that, in fact, the United States has a policy independent of China in Africa and always has, right? We can think about many different programs, initiatives, visits, et cetera, that's been going on. But because we're in this, competition over the vote at the UN General Assembly, there's a perception, I believe, and we overdo the perception that we're in this great competition with China. We are in a strategic competition with China globally, which also influences what happens in Africa, but we also have an independent policy towards Africa and have always had, independent of what Russia's doing, independent of what China's doing. So what I'm trying to say is that we're not in Africa because of China. We've been in Africa, now we're in a strategic competition with China globally, and that includes in Africa.
Right. So maybe instead of a Cold War, it's better to talk about a great game. For those of you who know Peter Hopkirk's book about Central Asia in the 19th century, where you had essentially Russia and Britain each trying to jostle to kind of have position. I think the way you frame it in terms of moving from an ideological fight in the 60s and 70s to a mercantilist fight on commodities later on to now we're really looking at strategic rivalry in quite a specific way is striking. But Mvemba, I'd love to ask you, how much of this, in your view, is America's fault for having dropped the ball on Africa? And I say that while you're collecting your thoughts because, one of the statistics that always stuns me is that if anyone has ever looked at the numbers for loans to low-income countries, until really about a decade ago, the West and institutions like the World Bank dominated loans to poor countries. Now they've been totally eclipsed by China, and China is the biggest lender to low-income countries today on the world stage. So if you want to understand why people in Africa might feel tempted to look to Beijing, not Washington, numbers like that are very striking. But Mvemba, in your view, why exactly has this happened, and has the West dropped the ball? Has Washington dropped the ball?
I think a couple of things, Gillian, and I think I want to start with a couple of points that Jendai made, with which I disagree. I don't believe that the US has had an Africa policy. I think the US has had strong engagement in different sectors, security being one, in the context of the old Cold War, development, humanitarian aid. You go to places like DRC, to places like Mozambique and others. The US is very present, USAID and so on. But if you were to ask what is the overarching US stance on Africa, then I'll say there is none. Right? We're struggling to define what our relationship with Africa is. And even the terminology we use, Cold War. Whose Cold War? Who is at war? Africa has been dealing with foreign powers for 500 years. So it's not new to the Africans. They've seen Portuguese arrive, they've seen the French, they've kicked others, welcomed the new ones, and so on. That's the context of the African market.
So in fact, you've got Chinese restaurants in Lagos, it's no longer...
No, it's not longer, but also to the point that Jendai made, the Chinese have been there.
Yeah.
They've been there since the 50s. They were accompanying countries in the independence movement. They were poor, so we didn't always pay attention to them. They lived in the village when they were expert in farming. They didn't drink avian water. They drank the water that people drank from the well, and so on. But at the same time, they had a long-run policy of engagement. They were fighting the Russians. They didn't want to be in the pocket of the Russian. They wanted to be their own. So they stuck out their own territory. So I think what the challenge really is like after the Cold War collapsed, the Berlin Wall collapsed, the US did not really redefine a clear position vis-à-vis African countries. In fact, we saw that the countries that had been close partners of the United States, places like Zaire, places like Somalia, Ethiopia, Liberia, and so on, all those countries went to chaos. War, civil wars, that's exactly what happened because the US did not have a policy after the Berlin Wall. You had a new set of leadership in Washington who were pretty much iconoclast. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they were like, down with the dictators, down with the Cold War, we're going to do things our own way. So people like Mobutu CIA made and all this stuff were read their riot by Bill Richardson say, if you don't leave power, we're going to drag your body into the street of Kinshasa. So how do you go from being a partner with a country to threatening them in the time of difficulty? So African remembers that. They remember that because it's like, can you count on the United States? Can you count on the West? So there is a deficit, a trust deficit, to be clear. The Africans and the rest of the global South have decolonized. The West is not decolonized. Decolonizing the mind, decolonizing the paradigm. So we have been incapable in the greater North to see Africa as potential partners. So France is a case, always in trouble with its own people, its own colonies. Leaders from the world visit Africa, American president, VP Harris, and so on. They give speeches. Sometimes we remember them, sometimes we don't. The French go to Africa, it's always chaos. It doesn't matter which French president it is, they're speaking French, the African understand French, there's always a sentence or a paragraph that causes riot all over the place. And it doesn't matter if they're young like Macron or old like Mitterrand. It's always the same problem.
Yeah.
So this speaks to the psychology of not looking at the Africans as potential partners. What do I mean by partner, to be sure? We have, this word is big. Now we have the new US-Africa strategy, which is great. Yeah, it recognizes African agency. It wants to be close to Africa and recognize the youth of Africa. But what we're not saying is we want to stick with you. Let's look at Asia. We stuck with Thailand. They have coups and counter coups and stuff in Thailand. But Thailand is squarely our partner. We look at South Korea. They had wars, they had, I understand the context is different, Cold War and all that stuff. But they were messy places.
Yeah.
We stuck with them. The Philippines, we stuck with them, and so on. There is no such country in Africa that the US can say, these are our partners.
Right.
Yeah? Yet we take them for granted. When Ukraine happens, we always wanting to bring them to our own crisis and say, be with us. And the Africans are asking, why? What have you done for us lately? Then I'll close with, and then again, sticking on this psychology part. I remember driving from Joburg one time, for Johannesburg, to Soweto, and I look out the window, and I saw these big chimneys, all the industrialization. I'm like, aha, now I see why Americans like South Africa. It reminds them of Ohio. You know, it's really like, they feel at home. You know?
Right.
So
Right.
As Westerners, often it's challenging for Western to get in another place and feel comfortable.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like when I end with it's like when you're from the West, since we're in the West. When I lived in Philadelphia, when I had Western friends, they always say, it's very difficult to find my way around here. I'm like, what do you mean? We have 4th Street, 5th Street, Cherry. They're like, there's no mountain. Right? So everybody guide themselves by mountains. Yeah. And once mountains are not there, so this is the problem with the West. You get to Africa, the investors say, it's chaos here. The Chinese don't see chaos. The Indians don't see chaos. It reminds them of home.
So tell me, I mean, Jandai, you probably disagree with some of what Mvemba said, did you? Do you want to tell us quickly what you disagree with? And then I want to turn to the issue of minerals.
I disagree with some of what he says, not all of what he says. I think it's very easy to say that the United States doesn't have a policy towards Africa. Africa is 54, 55 countries, right? We don't really say, what's our policy towards Europe? We say, what's our policy towards France or UK or Germany, et cetera. So, you know, that's part of the problem right there. What you have to have as an administration is a strategy towards Africa. And within that strategy, you have to avoid being pulled into becoming a firefighter because there's so many crises in Africa, right? And so, I mean, there are many crises, not, you know, the majority is not the case, but there are many big crises there, like Sudan or the Ethiopia war with, you know, internal war that just happened, or, you know, Central African Republic or DRC, or, you know, and so as an administration, you have to avoid having your strategy just become trying to put out fires. And that's not easy in an environment in which particularly the humanitarian and human rights community are the biggest constituencies for Africa, and you don't hear the voices of the business community and others. in terms of constituency. And so you get pulled, especially our Congress and others, you get pulled towards firefighting instead of really trying to maintain a serious strategy while you have individual policies towards particular countries.
Right.
So what I do agree with him, though, is that there is a mindset that needs to change. And that really is about each administration often develops its own sense of a strategy, and that consistency across administrations. That's the challenge of democracy and foreign policy and national security, is how do you maintain that consistency across administrations, right? That's why I'm saying authoritarians have an easier time of it, right? They can say we're going to do this over the next 15 years. The difference between President Bush and President Trump, both Republicans, on Africa is night and day.
Right.
It's night and day. The difference between President Bush and President Obama was not night and day, but it was a matter of engagement. Bush engaged far more than Obama did on Africa, right? And so but we do have programs that persist. The Africa Growth and Opportunity Act that Clinton put in place, everyone has kept it. Every single administration since then. PEPFAR that Bush put in place, every administration has kept it since then. The Young Africa Leaders Initiative that Obama put in place, everyone has kept it since then. People always want to say we do humanitarian assistance. They forget about the Millennium Challenge account, right? That's not humanitarian assistance. That is serious money going into infrastructure and other areas.
Right.
We do have what was OPIC. The Trump administration changed that. They put Prosper Africa. So we have initiatives and programs that do carry on across administrations, but the tone of the policy, the strategy of the policy changes by administration.
Right. So, I mean, obviously now the dominant theme for the Biden administration, for those of you who didn't see the Bidenomics speech yesterday, or the earlier speech from Ambassador Tai, or the other messages coming out of the White House, the dominant theme is supply chain, supply chain, supply chains. And the administration has rolled out a series of, quasi-initiatives with allies to try and secure critical minerals like lithium, cobalt, and things like that. I mean, how do Africans feel about that? Is that sort of, just another sign of, the West cynically turning to Africa when it's convenient to try and get, decent, high-quality minerals?
The median age in Africa is 19. Yeah, the median age in Africa is 19.
That's a median age.
That's the median age. That means the countries that have the average 15 years old, or 12, and so on. This means the future of the world, there's no contingency that the world deals with that does not have its solution in Africa. Africans are wondering, why are you always talking about resources? For 500 years, it's been about resources. It's never been about the people, right? It's about the trade. Let's bring resources, human resources, to the new world. It's been about spices, which you never use in your cooking. After you get all this stuff, it's always about some kind of resources.
Yeah.
And then eventually, now we're talking about rare earth minerals.
Rare earth minerals, lithium.
But we had 30 years, 40 years of people wanting real development. Real development. There was no Soviet Union. China was eking his way in. But we're not investing massively in those countries. And now we say, by the way, we want your resources again. Don't talk to China, talk to us. So we've seen over the last year, every 2 weeks, at least it felt that way, there's another package of $15 billion sent to Ukraine. It's a war. Ukraine doesn't give you raw material, doesn't give you rare earth minerals. And then Africans are saying, but we just need a road over here. We just need a bridge over here. We need schools. By the way, there's no place in the world that is so close to the West, that is such a low-hanging fruit, and it's Africa.
Right.
Right? We speak your languages. We speak more French than the French do. The largest Francophone city is Kinshasa, which is my hometown, not Paris. Without Africans, French will be spoken like German or like Norwegian. In other words, not many people will be speaking it outside those borders.
Yes.
But what has France done for Africa? Economically, not much. It's the same with us. So I'm saying that issue itself would always giving us.
Right.
Africans are tired. They say, what about our youth? It's the future of the world. This is what I mean by building real partnership. The 12-year-old in Zambia may be carrying a Huawei phone, but that 12-year-old is not listening to Radio Beijing or to Russia Today. That 12-year-old knows everything about Kim Kardashian and Khloe. In other words, they want America. They're not trying to go to Shanghai. So we are busy designing this Cold War with all the strategy that's totally irrelevant to the future of the world, who are this 12-year-old and 19.
Yeah. So what China has done, you make very good points, is obviously move in and develop a lot of infrastructure, a huge amount of transport and logistics infrastructure, which the West did not do. And China has also moved in and really played a very significant role rolling out Chinese technology and internet and telecoms, again, which has happened to some degree, but not significantly from the West. Do you think that China now has essentially a stranglehold on the logistics of many countries now? Is it too late?
No, it's not too late. It's not too late. I think they've made a lot of progress. I think this is why I'm insisting on the paradigm shift. You talk to investment leaders, Jendai was mentioning Exim Bank, DFC, all these new organizations. But when you talk to them, they're very limited in the way they see things. There's no creativity. They always tell you about what they cannot do, not about what they can do. Yeah, this is a challenge even when you talk to American diplomats. You get a diplomat who listens to you, and Jendai was like this when she was at State Department. You can talk to her, she listens to you, and she says, this we cannot do, but we can do that. That's what Africa needs. More people in America, more people in the West says, we cannot do this, but we can do this for you. So I get a lot of pessimism when you talk. They say, well, we cannot really compete with the Chinese on infrastructure. I say, yes, we can. I mean, there's history of this. When I was a child, there's a big dam in Congo called the Inga Dam. The Congo holds 50% of the hydroelectric potential of Africa.
Wow.
And that dam was built in part with US technology and Western technology. And the high power lines, were actually structured and built by a Western consortium made of Morrison Knudsen out of Idaho, COGEPI out of Italy, and CSF Thompson out of France. So we can do this stuff. It's like, what did they have in the 1970s that they could deliver those kind of projects? That today, with more money, we're seeing limits. The US is strong with education. We can invest in universities. They will be lucrative. Again, they're 12-year-old, so they'll be going to school. Right? It's long term. We're not investing in that. The Chinese may have Huawei. We have better technology on any other thing. But we're not doing that step. We're not making that step. That's the key.
But the problem is, I was with Ambassador Thick in Washington last week, and he's just been appointed by the Biden administration as the first ever digital ambassador. And what that means is he's charged with going around the world and trying to stop China from monopolizing everything on the tech and internet side. And, full of ideas about, how we can go to Africa and persuade them to embrace Western technology, not Huawei, for example. But, if you haven't got a rapid decision-making process, if you haven't got the ability to actually hand out support and provide the kind of support that the Chinese have been providing, does America have any hope of actually getting into the digital game, for example? I mean,
America is in the digital game. I think we're overstating things here. I mean, and I would do the same. I would try to really hammer the point that America should be more engaged in Africa, right? And that our companies should be more engaged, and China's doing great. Well, most of those companies that are doing all that infrastructure development and technology development in Africa are state-owned companies that are directed to do it without any consideration of a financial return. Our businesses don't work that way, and our government doesn't work that way. And so I think it's wrong to suggest that somehow, the United States is missing the boat. There are opportunities, and we should be doing more to support our companies going into Africa and doing good business, right? I think that's extremely important, going into Africa and doing good business, right? And I say that because I know, as a person who's worked with American companies, helping them with market entry, helping them with trying to navigate those markets, that I can sit there with Chinese companies, state-owned, 3 or 4 different branches of the same one, and those guys are handing out money under the table. I know for a fact that they are. I've seen it. I've actually been in a room when they're doing it. I've even had ministers say they just did this. What are you going to offer, right? I mean, that's a reality.
And what do you say when that happens?
Here's the problem, right? American business would probably give them the money under the table too, right? Because they want the business. But the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the penalties is far more than the business they would have ever gotten, right? That's a reality, right? So, we can't just say, well, it's apples and oranges, they're both fruit, get in there and do your thing.
Yeah.
It's an entirely different environment for American business. It's the second thing I'll say, which is our businesses aren't state directed. We can incentivize them, and we should do a better job as a government to incentivize them. But there's 54 African markets. They're little tiny markets. Our businesses would rather go to China, have their IP stolen, deal with all the harassment that they have, and get the benefit of that huge market, right? So the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, if it actually becomes a reality, it's in force, but if it actually gets to become a reality that can integrate that market, you can believe that American business will be in there. Because right now they have to deal with 54 different regulatory bodies. They just can't do that.
Of course,
they need scale, right?
I just want to come back on that point, though. We're not. I was in business before, and this foreign corrupt practice, it's very serious. People asking you for money, it's very limiting. But at the same time, I think the U.S., since we're here, can scale up its guarantee, its risk guarantees.
Yes.
That's what the Chinese are doing. The Chinese, I don't think
Through
it's
things
also
like
correct.
Exim Bank,
Yeah, it's not just correct to
providing.
say Chinese are all state, because the Chinese are taking huge risks. I think this is what gets lost in. The Chinese are losing money as well. They're not just making money.
Well,
But they're okay with losing that money because the government is directing them for
but
other reasons.
No, correct, but let me finish.
They're not looking for commercial return.
It's part of the overarching policy, right? They're losing money. They've been threatened with nationalization. They've changed their policies over time. There was a time where China would just come and put in money, have barter type of arrangement. Now they want to do more PPP with these countries because they have to hedge their risk. So they're doing all kinds of things. There's a sense for us in the West to say, when you get it right, we'll show up, right? And by that, when we reduce our level of risk, when rule of law is working, well, by that time, by the way, we were about the Chinese. There are other powers that are doing just well in Africa. One is Turkey. One is Turkey. Turkey, tremendous soft power. You go to any major capital in Africa, you find an international Turkish school. Yeah, they're building all the...
And a great Turkish restaurant.
Yeah, great Turkish. They're building, Turkish airline is one of the most favored airline in Africa, right? There's problem with visas, that's which we've not talked about. How do you become partner with people when you're building yourself into a fortress? This is the case of Europe, right? Europe loves to say, we really care about Africa, they're our neighbors. No, you're bad neighbors. Yeah? A neighbor who doesn't let you into their areas, always blocking the street by their house, is not a good neighbor. Yeah? Your kids never play with their kids. It's not a good neighbor. So there are many other layers beyond what we've just outlined.
Right. I'm going to turn to the audience for questions in just a moment. Before I do, though, I'd like to quickly ask you, Mvimba, you say that the Chinese are now losing money on all their investments, and it's true. The Belt and Road Initiative has been spectacularly loss-making, and there's lots of big, bad loans sitting inside there. And the Chinese, in some incidents, are starting to actually call in those loans or take control of the assets. And you're getting very ugly situations in Congo, in Zaire, with debt restructuring, because a number of poor countries around the world right now are falling into debt crises and discovering they can't get any kind of proper sovereign debt restructuring because China accounts for a large part of the loans, and China and the IMF are not sitting down on the table together, let alone with the Paris Club. Do you think Africans that you know now trust China? I mean, when they look at these loans, these big sort of projects, is there a growing realization that they come with a catch?
Yeah, so there are two layers, and Jendai framed this well. We have the leaders, the dictators, whatever they are, semi-democrats. I mean, they define themselves differently. They see different interests in engaging with China. The politicians want to rule so they can tell people what I did, vote for me. The populations at large are not in love with China because the populations know about the debt. You go to a place like Zambia that is up to here in debt. They're not happy with the Chinese. So it's a very tricky situation. But China, in the meantime, has become so powerful, even to the IMF, even at the World Bank. So they can also stop things within those Bretton Woods institutions. So Africa need to be wiser, but we have also seen, to the African credit, not all of them, Jendai mentioned 54 countries. Let's look at a country like Tanzania. Tanzania and Zambia were really the darlings of China. You know, the biggest project that China did in the 70s, 80s, the Tazara Railroad, was between Zambia and Tanzania. But even both those countries are now renegotiating with China. Magufuli literally suspended Chinese project and say, unless you give us a better deal, we no longer move forward. Zambia now is saying, we don't want to be in your grip. Janet Yellen, please come here, help us structure things. So things are, it's not ironclad. The many dynamics going
Absolutely.
in there.
Well, there's definitely a potential moment for a shift, given that China is getting more concerned about the bad loans in its Belt and Road projects. And of course, you know, Biden in America does claim to be more interested in Africa, you know, because of the supply chain issues. But we're going to go to the audience for questions. Do you have anything to add on this before we do?
Just one very quick point. You asked, is China so dominant, and is there still room for the West or for the U.S.? There's tremendous room for the West and the U.S. Just take energy, for example, and electricity. You know, half of the population of 1.2 billion people in Africa have no access to electricity, 600 million. That's a tremendous area for American investment. Now, China's put huge investment in solar, and solar would be an outstanding technology to proliferate across Africa. But there's tremendous opportunity. What I think is necessary is for the American government to incentivize U.S. companies to work in joint ventures with African companies, which is what the Chinese do not do. They actually take those contracts from African companies, particularly construction, and give it to their own citizens, their own companies. But if we could do those kinds of joint partnerships, I think there's tremendous opportunity. What I'm concerned about on the internet side or on their digital Silk Road is that they lock African countries into adopting their standards. And that is part of the global governance issues that we have to face. And that's where the real competition with China is. It's not Huawei's, technology proliferating across Africa. That is true, and that's there. Often it's bottom of the pyramid type of, because it's a cost factor, right? People want their Apple phones, but they can't afford them. So it's aspirational. And as they get more money and they go from 19 to 25, they might get their Apple phone because that's what they want. But they're going to take the transmission phone or the Ericsson phone from the Chinese, Nokia as well from Europe, because they're a lower price point. So they're mining the bottom of the pyramid, which if only our companies could do that as well, it would be, I think,
but the point
a tremendous market.
The point you make about public-private partnerships, I think, is absolutely fascinating.
Yes.
It's going to be critical the next year or two. Right, we have a lot of people here. Any questions? We got a question over here straight away, and it would be courteous but not compulsory to identify yourself. So there, and then there, and then there.
Okay, my name is Benton Caspin, and just for reference, this fall I'm getting ready for my 7th trip to Africa. And question that I've got, because I know there's civil war in Sudan, the DRC's got internal strife, the Central African Republic's being torn apart, and Nigeria still kind of got a lot of simmering issues for civil war. This increasing tribalism that I've heard about, is that creating a lot of problem for being able to lock down deals and being able to do trade with the West?
So, is political risk blowing up deals?
I'm going to let you answer that.
I think it's a good question. Africa has 54 countries. That's one. So if you name Sudan, DRC, Nigeria, CAR, that's only 4 out of 54 countries. So there's an entire market people can delve into. This is part of the paradigm shift. We've been so caught up in thinking of Africa as this downtrodden, underdeveloped, tribalism, warfare. That's actually a problem for the way we analyze Africa. It's the prism that needs to be changed. You can go to Botswana and invest, you'll be just fine. Gabon, you can invest in Gabon, you should be just fine. You can go to
Ghana.
Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, and so on. All these countries have the various problems, but so do we in the United States. If I was analyzing the United States from DRC, I can give you the same stuff. Yeah, there's ethnic strife over there. There's Western state, red state, blue state. You never can go to school and be sure if you're going to be shot by your colleague or by your classmate. You never can go to a movie. So there's an entire body of things. Then they hide the potential.
But I think we need to be honest, right? I mean, I really do. I'm the one making your points normally because I'm trying to convince audiences that going to Africa is important and there's opportunity there. And you know that already because you've been many times. But, you know, sanctity of contract, rule of law so that you can expect in a commercial court that if something happens, you actually have a chance. Those things actually matter for commercial deals, right? And so it's what, yeah, the Africans are scared to come to America because they think that mass shootings are happening everywhere, right? They're literally scared. Right? But so the perception is always there, too much risk, too much risk, too much risk. So I take your point. It's not too much risk, not in all these countries. But even a good country like Kenya, every election cycle, business stops until it's sorted, right? And I mean, how can you have, or let's take South Africa, power shut-in, right? I mean, so I'm not trying to be negative. What I'm trying to say is that's why I say joint ventures are very important because you got to go in with your eyes wide open. I've seen too many multinational corporations get all excited because we're making a case for Africa, all these people, all this market. They run in there, and then they run right back out because no one's told them the truth about how difficult it actually is, right? And I'm not saying it's not difficult in Chicago or New York, construction or whatever, you know, but you have to go in with your eyes wide open with some expertise and with some people who know how to manage in those countries and to do business there.
No, I agree fully. But one thing that, when I was in business, one thing we considered was you partner with advisory firms in countries.
Yes, yes.
Because they know how to navigate the stuff,
Yes.
and it shields you from the FCPA.
Yes,
Right.
Yes, yes.
So there
We
are
have
many ways you can do that.
yes.
We have a question there, and then another question over there, and then.
Hi, my name is Jorge Guajardo. I'm from Mexico. And interested in this panel, Africa has now made it into the Aspen Ideas. Latin America has fallen off. But we're now talking about how Africa is a new region for the Cold War to be fought. Before it was Latin America, the new region, or sometimes it's missed. I served 6 years as Mexico's ambassador to China. I can tell you there is no Chinese policy towards Latin America or Africa. In fact, we were usually pegged together. That was my experience when I was in China. Usually Latin America and Africa were seen in the same vein, extractive industries. And to think that China is making big moves, I think is somewhat false. But to think that the United States is the good guy is also wrong. Because you mentioned FCPA. Well, Walmart corrupted half of Mexico to get store permits. JP Morgan corrupted half of China to get deals. So this idea that the Chinese are bad, the Americans are good, we're just facing different rules, I don't think that is true. I think a lot of it is political. And I think, as you say, there is a huge trust deficit from the political class, which refers to our countries in very dismissive terms, in a way the Chinese do not. And in that sense, how do you address the political way the U.S. addresses these regions? That would be my question.
That's a great question. While you're collecting your thoughts on that, let's take a couple more questions. We haven't got much time. We've got a question over there as well. And I want to try and get several voices and then roll them together.
My name is Arturo Brillenburg. I'm originally a Venezuelan, but U.S. Here for many years. So I was trying to get this discussion. I realized this is about Cold War. War is about countries and government policy. But you realize that the only thing that's going to get Africa going is investment by the private sector. That's where the wealth is. The governments don't have enough money to give it to Africa for it to develop. And The fear is if Africans doesn't get their act together, there won't be the investment, and we'll have this discussion years from now. So what I wanted to do was to try to get this, if we could get anything productive out of this thing, which is what are the good examples in Africa that they have been doing that other African countries can get together and do?
That's a great question. Let's just take one last question just over here, and then roll those together. And I'm afraid we're then probably going to have you answer those questions in whatever order you would like, because we're almost against time. And by the way, I totally agree that there are some amazing business stories in Africa. I mean, just go to Nigeria and see the vibrancy of the creative industries today. It's astonishing, explosive what's happening there.
Oh, thank you. My name is Claire, and I live here in the Valley. And my question is, with the shift in strategy to mercantilism, does that lend itself to be more partnership-oriented, or would you say the U.S. is still in their old paradigm of colonialism?
Yeah, that's great questions. Should I try to start?
Yep, you go first. You've each got 2.5 minutes to jump in. Exactly.
Very quickly. I actually said if it wasn't for FCPA and the small fragmented market size of African countries, American business would probably go under the table too, right? So it's not an issue of they're bad and we're good. That's not. It's that if anything, our regulatory environment is so stiff for American companies. Right, the environmental studies that one has to do, the feasibility studies to get that guarantee that would cut down that risk. It's a pretty high cost for companies for a very small market. So we need to restructure all of that on the commercial side, right? And the government needs to take a leadership role in saying what's the real environment that you're trying to invest in, and how can we create products, institutions, incentives for you to be able to do that so that you can compete, right? And so I think that's the issue.
Right.
On the political side, it's exactly what Bemba said. We have a colonial mindset, and I'm not talking about colonization. The question becomes, and he mentioned it, and I'll say it, Europe's annual population growth is negative 0.2%. Africa's population growth is about 2.3%. Young Africans are going to be the majority of the workforce in the future. They're going to be more than half of the young population. Europe needs those people, but yet it's setting up barriers for them to come in. To me, if you can answer why that's the case, then you can take the shackles off the mind, and people can see Africa for the opportunity that it really is. Right? There's a reason why they don't want those young Africans, even talented ones, in Europe. That's the problem. And until we solve that, that's the mindset. Yeah. On the commercial side, I think digital, because you don't need a lot of the infrastructure. Like I'm talking about, roads. You don't need that for digital, right? I mean, if you look at the explosion of Afropop coming out of Nigeria and its impact worldwide, right? It's because there's certain infrastructure barriers that was not required digitally, right? And so if Africa can leverage on the digital platforms, and there's tremendous opportunity there. Mobile money, Africa makes up 70% of the mobile money global market, right? Over $1 trillion, there's 70% of that. That's another way in which, and so trying to find those areas where Africa could really leverage up using digital and others, I think is a possibility.
Right. Well, those are nice, optimistic points to make. I mean, certainly the story of M-Pesa is remarkable, and reverse innovation, bringing ideas from Africa into Western markets, has been, very, very interesting. Mbembe, you have got a minute or two. We're almost out of time.
Quickly. Jorge, I disagree. Chinese has a consistent position. You can call it strategy, you can call it a stance in the way they engage. That's how they engage you in Latin America. That's how they engage Africa. Extract, soft power, soft power. I go to Malawi, I'm sitting in my hotel room, everything is in Chinese. Like literally the remote control. There's a little note telling me in English what that means. That goes a long way, right? And you see this across the continent. Arturo, I'll say, we should not worry so much about the size of the market. We should worry about the industries, the specific sectors. And those sectors are similar across the continent. So if telecom, if people in pharmaceutical, they can invest specifically in those spaces, then MTN is in Mozambique, is in Congo, is everywhere. It's MTN, right? So for them, it's not Congo, it's the entire African market that they have. There are countries that are doing fine. By fine, I mean they have the challenges of every other country. Botswana is one. We over-belabor Botswana maybe. But Kenya, I'm a big fan of Kenya because Kenya is not a developmental state. They don't wait for the Norwegian or the Americans to give them money. They try to do the best they can do. They levy taxes. They produce flowers. They do great tourism. To me, it's a positive country. They do 2 steps back in elections. The next time they do the best elections, So that I mean by sometime we have similar problems here. They're just a younger country, still trying to figure that out. In terms of paradigm, it's really the key, I think, for us. Because our lack of creativity, we are very creative people. This is the United States. But when it comes to Africa, we cannot be creative because there's this blind something that has happened. And we also like to follow the Europeans too much. If we believe Europeans, they don't understand Africa. If they understood Africa, they will not have the problem in Africa. They will not be hiding behind the walls of Frontex. So let's be Americans. Let's engage them through our own prism, just like the Chinese are doing.
We agree 100% on that.
Okay.
Well, that seems like a great moment to end on. So thank you very much indeed for educating us all. Thank you.